there. You recently sent us this Washington Post article about walking pneumonia. Cases are going up in kids, especially the little ones. And we thought we'd take a deep dive together to see what's really going on. Like, is it as scary as it sounds?
Well, the name itself, walking pneumonia, is a bit misleading.
Yeah.
It sounds almost harmless, like you said,
Yeah.
but it is still a type of pneumonia.
Right. Yeah, that's what caught my eye, too. So what exactly is going on with walking pneumonia? Break it down for us.
So walking pneumonia is caused by bacteria called Mycoplasma pneumonia.
Okay.
Now, this bacteria can cause a range of respiratory infections, from mild to more serious. When it develops into pneumonia, that's when it's often called walking pneumonia. Because unlike other types of pneumonia, people often don't feel so sick that they need to be bedridden.
So it's more like you're walking around with pneumonia rather than being knocked flat on your back?
Right, exactly.
I get it. But how is that different from regular pneumonia?
Good question. Regular pneumonia can be caused by a whole host of things: bacteria, viruses, even fungi. And it can often get pretty severe, landing people in the hospital. Walking pneumonia, on the other hand, is specifically caused by this Mycoplasma pneumonia, and it typically doesn't hit people as hard.
Okay, so it's still pneumonia, but usually milder.
Usually, yeah.
But what makes this so tricky is that it often starts like a common cold, right?
You're absolutely right. In the beginning, you might see those classic cold symptoms, runny nose, congestion, maybe a fever, headache, you name it. It can be really tough to tell the difference at first.
So how can you tell if it's more than just a sniffle? When should you start thinking, uh-oh, this could be walking pneumonia?
Here's the thing. Walking pneumonia eventually starts affecting the lungs.
Okay.
That's when you see a persistent cough that just won't quit, sometimes chest pain, and even shortness of breath.
So that deep hacking cough that hangs around for weeks, that's a telltale sign. The article also mentioned something about kids getting rashes.
Yes, particularly in younger children. Sometimes walking pneumonia can cause these hives-like rashes, which you wouldn't typically see with a regular cold. They can also experience headaches or even diarrhea.
Wow. Okay, so let's say you suspect your child might have walking pneumonia. What should you do?
The first step is to get a proper diagnosis from your doctor.
Okay.
They can take a throat or a nasal swab to check for the Mycoplasma pneumonia.
And if it comes back positive, how is walking pneumonia treated?
Most often, it's treated with antibiotics like azithromycin. It's important to note that some antibiotics, like penicillin, don't work against this particular bacteria.
So it's really crucial to follow your doctor's instructions carefully? What about preventing walking pneumonia in the first place? What can we do?
The good news is that many of the same precautions we take for other respiratory illnesses apply here. Good hygiene is key. Think frequent hand washing, covering those coughs and sneezes, and staying home when you're sick.
Those classic hygiene habits. We all became pros during the pandemic, right?
Exactly. And there's a quote from a CDC epidemiologist in the article that really stuck with me. They said that the things we do to avoid flu, RSV, and COVID-19 also work against Mycoplasma pneumonia. So we're already kind of in the habit of doing a lot of the right things.
That's reassuring to hear. And what about vaccinations? Is there a shot for walking pneumonia?
Unfortunately, there isn't a vaccine specifically for walking pneumonia.
Okay.
However, staying up to date on your flu and COVID-19 vaccines is still really important. It helps to protect overall respiratory health and can reduce the risk of complications if you do get sick, even from something like walking pneumonia.
Okay, so that's one more reason to stay current on those vaccines. Now let's talk about this concerning rise in cases. What are the experts saying about why we're seeing this uptick, particularly in these younger kids?
There are two main theories circulating right now, both of which are discussed in the article you shared. The first is that we might be seeing a pandemic-related immunity gap.
Because kids were isolated for so long and their immune systems didn't get that workout they normally would.
Exactly. They haven't been exposed to as many common pathogens like Mycoplasma pneumonia. The article even quotes an expert who says, and I quote, "Like with most things, we are blaming the pandemic."
It seems like blame the pandemic is becoming a familiar refrain these days.
It really does. And the second theory is that there might be a new strain of the bacteria circulating, one that's potentially more contagious, or that's affecting younger children differently.
So it could be this immunity gap, a new strain, or maybe even a combination of both. It seems like researchers are still trying to piece together the puzzle, but focusing on what we do know, when should parents be worried? What are the signs that it's time to seek medical attention?
One of the biggest red flags is a cough that just won't quit. If your child's cough lingers for more than 7 days, it's definitely time to get them checked out.
So longer than your typical cold, that's a sign to take action.
Exactly. And no matter what you think might be causing it, if you ever notice your child is breathing rapidly or struggling to breathe, seek medical attention immediately.
That's a no-brainer. Better safe than sorry. But it's reassuring to hear that most cases of walking pneumonia are treatable with antibiotics, and that hospitalizations are relatively rare.
That's right. Most cases are mild and respond well to antibiotics.
Okay, that's good to know. But the article did mention that some cases do end up in the hospital. What usually leads to that?
Hospitalization is usually necessary when complications develop, such as dangerously low oxygen levels or dehydration, which can sometimes happen as a result of the pneumonia.
So while we shouldn't panic, it's still important to take walking pneumonia seriously and get the right medical care.
Absolutely. Early diagnosis and treatment can make all the difference in preventing those more serious complications.
Okay, that makes sense. So far, we've covered a lot about walking pneumonia, what it is, how it differs from a common cold, those telltale symptoms, treatment options, and even some of the possible explanations for this recent surge in cases, particularly in those younger kids.
And we've talked about those everyday hygiene practices that can make a big difference in prevention, along with the importance of staying current on those flu and COVID-19 vaccines.
Right, those are our everyday health essentials. Now, before we move on, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. We've been talking about how the pandemic might be playing a role in this uptick in walking pneumonia. But what if these immunity gaps are just the tip of the iceberg?
That's a great question, and it leads us to another point that's worth considering. What if? What if this rise in walking pneumonia is a sign of other surprise illnesses to come? Could this be a preview of what happens when those pandemic-related immunity gaps collide with other factors like new strains or even the changing climate?
That's a pretty sobering thought. Are there any specific illnesses that experts are keeping an eye on?
It's still early, but there's a lot of discussion in the scientific community about the potential for resurgences of certain respiratory viruses that were relatively quiet during the pandemic. We might see those start to make a comeback, potentially in more severe forms, as those immunity gaps persist.
So this could be a ripple effect, with one illness paving the way for others. What does that mean for us? How can we prepare for these potential health challenges?
It really underscores the importance of staying informed and vigilant. Keeping up with those core hygiene practices is essential, as is staying current on vaccinations. And this goes beyond just childhood vaccines. Adults need to make sure they're up to date on their boosters and recommended vaccines as well.
It's like we're all in this together, protecting ourselves and each other. Now, going back to walking pneumonia specifically, you mentioned earlier that there are two main theories about the recent surge in cases. One is the pandemic-related immunity gap, which we've discussed, and the other is the possibility of a new strain of the bacteria. Can you tell us more about that?
Right. Some researchers are looking into whether we might be dealing with a new, potentially more transmissible strain of Mycoplasma pneumonia. The idea is that this new strain could be contributing to the rise in cases, especially in younger children, who haven't built up immunity to it.
So it's like the virus is evolving and finding new ways to spread. Is there any evidence to support this theory?
There's no conclusive proof yet, but researchers are actively investigating this possibility. They're analyzing samples from recent cases to see if there are any genetic variations in the bacteria that might indicate a new strain.
That makes sense. So while the research is still ongoing, it's something to be aware of. It definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation. Now I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the difference between the common cold and walking pneumonia. You mentioned that walking pneumonia eventually affects the lungs, but how does that actually happen? How does a simple cold turn into something that reaches the lungs?
It's a good question, and one that often causes confusion. Remember, walking pneumonia is caused by a specific bacteria, Mycoplasma pneumonia. While colds are typically caused by viruses, this bacteria is particularly good at attaching itself to the lining of your respiratory tract, including the lining of your lungs.
So it's like it has this special ability to latch on and cause trouble, but why doesn't that happen with a regular cold?
Cold viruses tend to target the upper respiratory system, your nose, sinuses, and throat. And while they can sometimes travel down to the chest, they're not as efficient at infecting the lungs as Mycoplasma pneumonia is.
Okay, so it's about the type of germ and its preferred target, but how does this bacteria actually damage the lungs?
When Mycoplasma pneumonia attaches to the lining of the lungs, it triggers inflammation and can interfere with the normal function of those tiny air sacs in your lungs, called alveoli. These air sacs are responsible for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So when they become inflamed or filled with fluid, it can lead to those classic pneumonia symptoms, the coughing, chest pain, and shortness of breath.
It's like the bacteria is disrupting the lungs' ability to do their job. That's a clear picture of how a seemingly mild infection can become something more serious. Shifting gears a bit, the article also mentioned that while most cases of walking pneumonia are mild and treatable with antibiotics, there are some instances where hospitalization is required. Can you walk us through those scenarios?
Certainly. While most people recover without any major issues, um, there are a few situations where walking pneumonia can become more concerning. For instance, very young children, older adults, and people with weakened immune systems are generally more vulnerable to complications. They might experience more severe symptoms or have a harder time fighting off the infection.
So those are the folks who need to be extra cautious. What other red flags should people be watching for?
One of the biggest concerns with any type of pneumonia, including walking pneumonia, is difficulty breathing. If you or your child are struggling to breathe, experiencing rapid breathing, or if their lips or fingertips start to turn blue, that's a sign that you need immediate medical attention.
Those are clear signs that something is seriously wrong. What else should we be on the lookout for?
Another thing to watch for is dehydration. Fever, coughing, and difficulty breathing can all contribute to fluid loss, especially in young children. Signs of dehydration include decreased urination, dry mouth, sunken eyes, and extreme fatigue or lethargy.
So it's not just about the respiratory symptoms, but also these secondary effects that can occur.
Exactly. And while antibiotics are usually effective in treating walking pneumonia, sometimes the infection can lead to other complications, like ear infections, especially in children. Or in rare cases, it can even trigger more serious conditions like meningitis or encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain.
That sounds really scary. Are there any long-term effects from walking pneumonia?
In most cases, walking pneumonia doesn't cause any lasting damage. However, if it's not treated promptly and effectively, it can potentially lead to chronic lung problems, like bronchiectasis, a condition where the airways become permanently damaged and widened.
So early diagnosis and treatment are crucial to prevent these potential complications.
Absolutely. It's always better to err on the side of caution and seek medical advice if you have any concerns about your health or the health of your child.
That's great advice. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the basics of walking pneumonia to the more concerning aspects of the infection. But what I find particularly fascinating is this idea that the pandemic may have created a landscape where we're seeing a resurgence of certain illnesses like walking pneumonia.
It's a complex issue, and researchers are still working to understand the full extent of the pandemic's impact on our immune systems. But this rise in walking pneumonia cases is a powerful reminder that we can't just assume that things will go back to normal after a major health crisis.
It's a wake-up call to be more proactive about our health and to be aware of the potential for unexpected consequences down the road.
Exactly. We need to stay informed, adapt our behaviors, and support research efforts to better understand these emerging health challenges.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive, I want to bring up one more point from the article that I found particularly intriguing and mentioned that. It mentioned that some experts believe this rise in walking pneumonia could be an early warning sign of a broader trend. They're suggesting that we might see an increase in other respiratory infections, not just in children, but across all age groups in the coming years. What are your thoughts on that?
It's certainly a possibility, and one that we need to take seriously. As we've discussed, the pandemic disrupted our normal exposure to a variety of pathogens. This means that our immune systems might not be as primed as they would have been in a pre-pandemic world.
So it's like our immune systems got a bit rusty
Yeah.
during those years of lockdowns and social distancing.
Exactly. And as we return to our pre-pandemic routines, we're coming into contact with more people and more germs. This could lead to a resurgence, not just of walking pneumonia, but other respiratory infections that we haven't seen as much of in recent years.
Is there anything we can do to prepare for this potential wave of infections?
There are several things we can do to stay ahead of the curve. First and foremost, we need to make sure we're following those basic hygiene practices, washing our hands frequently, covering our coughs and sneezes, and staying home when we're sick.
Those are the tried and true methods, aren't they?
They are, and they're more important than ever. We also need to make sure we're staying up to date on our vaccinations, including those for flu, COVID-19, and any other recommended vaccines for our age group.
So it's about building those layers of protection.
Exactly. And if we do start to see an uptick in other respiratory infections, early detection and treatment will be key. to preventing serious complications.
That means paying attention to those early symptoms and seeking medical attention if we're concerned.
Right. It's always better to be safe than sorry. We need to be our own health advocates and not dismiss those early warning signs.
Well said. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into walking pneumonia, I think the key takeaway here is that this recent surge in cases could be a sign of things to come. It's a reminder that the pandemic's impact on our health is far from over, and that we need to be prepared for potential challenges down the road.
I completely agree. Walking pneumonia is just one example of how our changing world is impacting our health. We need to stay informed, adapt our behaviors, and be proactive in protecting ourselves and our communities.
That's a powerful message to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and I hope our listeners feel more informed and empowered to make healthy choices for themselves and their families.
I hope so too. And remember, if you have any concerns about your health or the health of your loved ones, don't hesitate to reach out to your healthcare provider. They are your best resource for personalized guidance and support.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay well.